And so you had to go to dry dock. You changed ships. I believe we have some pictures. These nice folks can look at it. And then you kind of moved to the Topeka, I believe, for the latter part of the war. But then you got to be part of a pretty famous part of history on that ship, didn't you?
Right.
We'll come back to that in a moment because it has a tie to Mr. Frank. Tell us when you entered the war, Mr. Frank.
December 10th, 1944.
Okay.
I was 25 years old.
And you were not in the Navy, you were in the Army, is that right?
Right.
Okay.
Infantry.
Infantry, Fort Jackson, came to Fort Bragg, did some training.
Well, it was very short. We went on to Fort McClellan, Alabama. Mm-hmm. That's where tough stuff started.
And for those of you that don't know the history of the war, during this period of time, the Americans had a big draft, and that draft was all centered around a Japanese invasion. How many of you remember this? The war was not ending. The Japanese were not going to surrender. And then, Mr. Frank, you were going to have to be part of that invasion of Japan.
Right.
And tell us, when you were training for that invasion, and that's what you were doing those months, what were you being told?
That there'd be 1 million men died.
In that invasion.
In the invasion.
Because the emperor had said that every man in Japan would die if necessary to defend their land.
Yeah.
And so this was the culture of the world in which they were living, and the sacrifice with which they were willing to give. And so you went to work every day knowing what awaited you.
Right.
And then, okay, so you leave Fort McClellan in Alabama, and you guys were transitioned to where?
Well, we went to Fort Meade in Maryland and got issued clothes to go to Germany. And then the war changed, and they called us back and took all the wool clothes and gave us cotton clothes.
Because you were going to the Philippines and ultimately to Japan.
Right.
And so now, and here's where your history's kind of crossed, kind of interestingly for us this morning. So you become part of this occupation force because this big thing happens that changes the world, right? Called the atomic bomb. And so that changes this invasion. Some of you might remember the history. The Americans are prepared with the Allied forces to invade Japan, knowing that it would take a million losses, not just 1 million men to invade Japan, but 1 million losses. And that's what they were training for in battling. But then, so when you get to the Philippines, you're battling in the Philippines, but then the atomic bomb is dropped and you become part of what?
Well, the occupation of Japan.
And then how long were you in the Philippines and then in Japan in that occupation?
Well, I can't remember real good, but maybe 2 or 3 months.
2 or 3 months. And then before the war ended, and then the war ended and you were there how long after the war ended?
In the Philippines?
No, in Japan, I'm sorry.
In Japan. I was about a little over a year.
A little over a year.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have some interesting things, and I think we'll show you some pictures. You also were in the Sea of Japan. So if you remember what happened, America gets victory over Japan in the Sea of Japan, in the Bay of Japan. On the Missouri, there is a peace treaty signed between the Emperor and MacArthur. You remember this great moment in history? And tell us where you were, because you had a nice view of it.
Our ship was anchored in the Tokyo Bay.
Right across from it.
From the Missouri.
And you could witness the whole thing.
Right.
Isn't it a marvelous piece of history to have been there in that moment? And so then the war ends, but you become part of that occupation as well, in the sense that y'all were in the Bay of, in Tokyo Bay.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And then you both visited Hiroshima.
Yeah.
A few months after, is that right, Mr. Frank? You tell us.
18 days after
18 days.
The stumps were smoking still.
And nobody had told them about radiation.
You're
And so
right.
how long after the bomb was dropped when you were there?
Well, we had the chance to go on liberty in Japan after the war, and we rode the train by Hiroshima,
Wow.
and it was completely destroyed.
Mr. Frank, I believe you told me that this week you were watching the tornado damage in Oklahoma, and it reminded you of that,
Right.
of the damage. I believe we have some pictures, Mr. David. If we, that one of you took some pictures, and I believe you brought us some pictures of that. Mr. Frank, in part of what he did, you'll see his pictures and his hat and his money that he earned, and some of their pictures. Mr. Frank's medals are here that he earned in the war. He also has some pottery here that you'll see charred that he picked up from Hiroshima when he was part of that history of that moment of the occupation of that. And so you came home in what year?
46.
46. The war was over.
Yeah, latter part of.
And you met this really nice lady that we all love.
Yeah.
And you married.
Right.
And have beautiful children that I think will be with us in the second service. And then you came home in what year?
46.
46. And did you come back to Goldsboro originally?
Yeah, well, yes.
And
moved to Goldberg.
And having
met
kind
my
of
wife in Mount Olive.
met your wife in Mount Olive, who is Miss Joyce's mother, who is passed away a few years ago.
Yeah.
But I have to say, one of the most pleasurable people I had the joy of knowing in my life. And so you both served, you both gave, you both were willing to put yourself in that place for our country. And today I just want to thank you, and this congregation wants to thank you for taking a few moments for sharing with us.
Thank you.
I believe they have your service pictures on the screen for you today. Will you give God praise for them and their service to our country? Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let me do this. Let me do this in case you missed it. Mr. Frank, tell these nice folks how old you are.
I'll be 94 in 7th of June.
And who drives you around town?
I do.
I do. Hold on. Mr. Woodrow, tell these folks how old you are.
I'll be 93 in July.
And who drives you around town?
Myself.
And your sister-in-law. I got to tell you this while we're together. I don't know, 2 years ago, Mr. Jim was here. He would remember it so well. Mr. Woodrow helps us build the Judgment House and tear it down. And he was here. We were tearing down the Judgment House. Some teenagers had come to help us on a Thursday. I remember the day so well. It was near the end. We were out back. Mr. Herb remembers. We were cutting up some wood because an elderly couple uses our scrap wood to burn in their fireplace. And Mr. Woodrow and these teenagers were cutting it up. And they came and they said, it's break time. And these kids said, good, I got to have something to drink and get a break. And they said, you coming, Mr. Woodrow? He said, nah, y'all get your break. I'll keep cutting this wood up. I love that. That was a great moment. God bless you guys. Thank you so much. All right. Mr. Frank, we're going to come right through here. Amen. Will you now join me in welcoming Mr. Frank Gregory and Mr. Woodrow Anderson to the stage? I think they like you guys. You can be seated. Thank you for that warm welcome for them. And so We're going to talk a little bit about your service in the military, and in particular in World War II. Mr. Frank, I'm going to begin with you this time. So you entered the war in what year? 44. Let's put your microphone there.
44.
Yeah, and were you drafted, or were you already in the military?
I was drafted.
You were drafted.
Yeah.
In 1944, and that was a significant thing. We'll talk about it a little bit, Mr. Frank, because it was during that point that the Allied forces, and America in particular, were preparing to invade Japan. Is that right?
Right.
And so where did you go to basic training?
Fort McClellan, Alabama.
And it was there that you were basically preparing for that Japanese invasion.
Right.
And what was the world being told during that time?
Well, they said 1 million men would get killed.
That was the world. And sometimes it's important for us because 60 years later, it's easy to lose sight of that. They knew what they were walking into in that moment. The Emperor Hiroshima had said, every man in Japan will die if necessary if the Americans invaded. And that was what they were preparing for. Of course, that shifted a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So, and you were in the Army, is that right, Mr. Frank?
Right. Infantry.
Infantry. And then tell us what branch you served in, Mr. Woodrow, and when you entered the war.
Volunteered for the Navy because they were fixing to draft me.
And you could choose. Yeah.
Yeah. So
you get to choose.
In May the 18th, 1942.
1942. So you were pretty early in the war.
Right.
Okay. And so, and then you, I guess, were in Norfolk. Is that right?
That's where my basic training was, in Norfolk.
And then I believe you brought us some pictures of your ship, the Philadelphia and the Topeka that
Right.
you served on. Mr. Frank, you brought us some great pictures of your war medals, and then your picture here, and then some unit things. And I want you to come see money that they earned in World War II. It's pretty valuable today, by the way. And that's not an invitation for you. Those of you who like to collect, for use of a better word. But, okay, so you go off to war 1944, and tell us about your ship and what its duties were.
Well, I spent 2 years on the Philadelphia. And in 1945, I was transferred to the USS Topeka
Okay.
in the Asian conflict.
Okay, and so then you're headed toward Japan at the end of the war.
Right.
And that's where it kind of intersects with your story a little bit, Mr. Frank, because you go to the Philippines. Tell us about that journey, and then ultimately to Japan.
Well, I didn't spend a whole lot of time in the Philippines, but I was in the Philippines when the atom bomb was dropped. And, of course, after that, we started packing them ships to invade Japan. And, by the way, there was a typhoon came along. We were in a convoy, typhoon come along. And I had a friend that lived close to me. He weighed 250 pounds, and he tried to go from one place to another on a destroyer, and it pulled him off. Never found him.
Wow.
No more. It was real sad.
The amazing sacrifice that you guys were willing to perform for our country. It amazes us to know what you're headed toward. So you go to Japan believing that you're going to invade Japan. History then tells us that a second atomic bomb is dropped, and then you guys are on the ground. How quickly after that?
Well, I went to Hiroshima. In fact, we went into Kure when we went to Japan, and 18 days later, we went to Hiroshima to see it.
After the bomb was dropped.
After the bomb was dropped.
And you told me that the stumps were still smoking.
Smoking, they still were. And I picked up a few little little cups and stuff like that.
And Mr. Frank has those here that were left from Hiroshima. You can see, you feel free to come after the service, the charring of the radiation there at Hiroshima. Of course, they were there 18 days afterwards, not knowing what we know about radiation and radioactive material and half-lives and things like that. And it's an amazing thing that you sit here today and all those soldiers. And so you were then part of that occupation force in Japan.
Right. For about a little over a year, I reckon.
A little over a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then their stories are so similar because you're on the Philadelphia, then moved to the Topeka, as you told us, because your ship was hit by a destroyer. And then you come back and you guys, you board the Topeka and then back journeying across the Atlantic back to Japan, right?
Yeah, after I left the Philadelphia, I went over to the Topeka, and it went through the canal over to the Pacific.
And tell the folks, because the Navy in 1942 to 44, your enemies were not always airplanes. They were because you were fighting the Germans at sea. What was the enemy that you were fighting?
Submarines, mines, all kinds of things.
And lots of ships sustained lots of damage, but you guys seemed to kind of...
The Lord carried us through.
Blessed you, didn't he?
Yes.
Really did. You have the distinct honor of witnessing something that all of us have seen in pictures, but you got to see it a little closer. Why don't you tell us about it? In the Tokyo Bay.
Oh, the signing of the peace treaty.
On the Missouri.
Yeah, we were anchored right there next to the...
So the Missouri's battle group, they were in that battle group, in that escort group. Their ship was docked beside it.